This is interesting. So let's talk about the letters. How has FDA been enforcing on the policy?
So this trend actually started prior to the agency in September 2025 coming out and saying that they're going to crack down on DTC advertising. The first example that we have of the agency enforcing in this space occurred in August of 2024. And that's when the agency issued a letter to Krazati. It was an untitled letter. At the time that the letter was issued, Krazati had two indications, one for non-small cell lung cancer and another that they'd recently received for colorectal cancer. And both of those were approved under accelerated approval through a single arm trial. Now, what's important with Krazati is, in my opinion, to date, the Krazati letter represents the most comprehensive and thorough example of this type of letter. And I would say if anybody is only going to look at one of these letters to get a sense for what the agency is doing, this is the letter to look at because Krazati is the most thorough and it provides the most in-depth analysis. And I think there's a lot that you can glean from looking at that letter. Now, that letter talks about a couple different violations, several violations, I should say. It talks about the presentation of disease control rate, or DCR, which is a combination of ORR plus stable disease, which we know from the guidance the agency is not supportive of from single-arm trials. It also talks about progression-free survival, overall survival, and then there's a few other CFL type presentations that are specific to this product. But I would say overall, the detail of the violations in the Krazati letter make it almost as informative as the guidance themselves that the agency has issued.
Wow. Yeah, it is very thorough. That's one word to describe it for sure. What's happened since the Krazati letter was issued?
Yeah, so I'm going to bring this graphic up, and I think it's important to take a look at the pattern here because when we map this out on a timeline, it makes a lot more sense what's going on. So when we look at the timeline of events, of course, we see our 2018 guidance here on the left. That's the final guidance, and then we see our 2023 guidance up here in the middle section. But starting in 2024 is where we see Krazati, and then the agency was kind of quiet for a little over a year. But then in March of 2025, we saw the Lygobi untitled letter issue. And what was really interesting about Lygobi is that it has a prior communication section. Now, prior communication sections in these untitled letters are usually redacted because it's pulling forward information that was provided in a previous advisory letter. So we can infer that Lygobi had come in for advisory comments and had probably been advised not to disseminate these progression-free survival and overall survival presentations. But they proceeded anyways, and they received that untitled letter in March of 2025. But where we really start to see this trend take off is in 2025 in September when all of the other untitled letters were coming out of the agency. We saw 6 of these letters targeting these specific types of presentations. That continued then into January, where Antiva, which had received a letter in September, Antiva received a second untitled letter for similar claims. And then in March of 2026, we saw 4 additional untitled letters, these coming out of CBER now for CBER regulated products. So we're seeing this evolution. We're seeing that this started as a series of letters that OPDP was issuing, but now CBER has realized that this is a very effective enforcement strategy, and they've started to issue letters in this space as well. So there is a very clear trend line here, and we can see a very consistent strategy being implemented by the agency in this space.
That's so interesting. And thanks for showing a visual. It's really great to see them all, see the evolution in this topic. Have you seen any patterns in the enforcement letters for the time to event presentations?
Yes, and we're seeing a very consistent approach on the part of the agency. And let me show you another graphic here because I think it'll make a lot more sense when we look at what kind of violations have been cited. So in this graphic, what we're looking at are the products that have received title letters in this space. And then we're also seeing the breakout of the different kinds of violations. So the first thing that stands out is that most of these letters have citations for violations related to progression-free survival, overall survival, disease-specific survival, relapse-free survival. These are kind of your basic time to event endpoints, and almost all of these have been cited for those kinds of presentations. We also see several of these examples being cited for DCR, disease control rate. Of course, that was in the original Cruzati letter, but we see this occurring in several other examples. And again, DCR is that combination of ORR with stable disease. The other interesting thing that's cropping up in these letters are citations around Kaplan-Meier presentations. So presenting progression-free survival or overall survival in combination with either a Kaplan-Meier label or suggestions that a Kaplan-Meier analysis was done to support PFS or OS. That's also being called out, and that's specifically called out in the context of the agency saying that presentations of Kaplan-Meier data from a single-arm trial suggests that the the data has achieved a greater level of statistical rigor than what it actually has. So they have been going out of their way to actually highlight when Kaplan-Meier estimates have been called out from single-arm trials. And then finally, we have, in the case of Anktiva, event avoidance, which in this case was Anktiva's claims that their product could help with cystectomy avoidance, which actually contradicted a warning precaution in their label. But you can see a very clear trend line that they're very consistent in the violations that are being cited in all of these letters.
Again, it's really great to see a visual, and it really kind of brings it home that this is a orchestrated campaign. Like, this is a theme for sure. So what can companies do to avoid compliance in the space, in
Well,
your
I think
opinion?
first of all, yeah,
Sorry.
if you're operating in the oncology space, I think the first thing that you want to do is make sure that you're familiar with these guidances if you aren't already. And I think most people are very familiar with these guidances. At the same time, I would recommend if you're considering doing any kind of time to event presentations, anything CFL related, especially if you're working off of a single arm trial, it's really important to submit those for advisory comment, get feedback from the agency first before you deploy those assets publicly. But you have more experience in this space than I do. So what are some suggestions you have, Virginia?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's accelerated approval is a double-edged sword from a promotional point of view, in my opinion. It can help the teams get really organized because you've got those strict timelines that you have to adhere to. You can get a really good relationship going with your OPDP reviewer because you're going to have a lot of touch points, and we've talked about that before. I always advise companies to do what you were just saying, like kind of take a more conservative approach. So you've got the 120 days during the launch period. Use the PI and do some PI based materials while you're submitting your CFL presentations or your big campaign visuals or anything like that for advisory comments. So you can kind of be working the timeline to your advantage. So you've got that 120 days, a few months to kind of get your ducks in a row and get some more robust materials out the door, hopefully, with the confidence that you've had OPDP's eyes on it. If you're going to launch with CFL type claims, and in some companies are in a competitive space and they're ready to just hit the ground running, and no judgment on that. But if you're going to do that, I would advise strongly to kind of isolate those presentations and those claims into some strategic materials so you're not going to be jeopardizing your whole suite of launch materials. That's just my humble opinion. But this has been a really good discussion. I know you spent a lot of time putting this together, so thank you. And I think, taking a step back and looking through, sifting through the large amount of enforcements that are coming out and picking apart the themes is really helpful. So thank you. And I can't wait to figure out what we talk about next. So this has been the Promotional Intelligence Podcast. So thank you all for joining us.